Because of stiff competition, companies realized using a single overhead rate was not the best way to come up with good estimates of how much their products cost because of the problem of misallocation. Also, companies, because of the competition, really had to look closely at their overhead. They had to take their overhead and look at what's causing these costs. This led to the management term activity-based costing, or ABC for short. And the idea behind it is you figure out the cause and effect of overhead costs. They first will identify the activities that each cost object entails. In other words, what kind of costs are needed in order to make the cost object. Not just, in other words, the direct material and direct labor, but really look at what is causing, or how is this cost object causing overhead to occur. Then what you would do is you'd separate this overhead into different cost pools. So, you figure out again the amount of the overhead and you separate them into different cost pools. And I'll explain that here in a minute. It's just basically taking your total overhead costs and splitting them up based on like activity. Then last, what you would do is you'd figure out a cost driver that makes sense to use to allocate the costs to the cost object. So here's some cost pools. We have the Human Resources Department. The Human Resources Department is there for the benefit of, say, making the product or whatever your cost object is. So how would you go about splitting up those costs to the different cost objects? Well, when you think about human resources, just like with the faculty in a previous problem, the number of employees would be a good way to allocate the costs, say, to the different departments or to the different products or services. The other would be maybe the number of new hires, because a lot of the costs in a human resources department goes into hiring new people. So those would be possible cost drivers. So in other words, remember the single overhead rate, where you take your total estimated overhead, you take your total estimated cost from that, divide it by the total number of employees, and then what you would do is multiply it by the number of employees for the particular cost object that you're trying to price, or the object that you're trying to come up with a cost for. Accounting department costs, that one's a tough one. You could take the time to have the accounting department figure out time spent on each cost object, but that could be pretty time consuming. A lot of time spent is coming up with reports for the different departments. So you might want to use number of reports run. The other is accounting departments process forms, so maybe you do the number of forms. These are just suggestions. There's probably many more, but yeah, I think hopefully you're getting the idea. Purchasing department, a lot of companies use purchase orders, so you could do the number of purchase orders, and so if you do a lot of purchases, you'd have more of the overhead cost from that department allocated to that cost object. And this would get rid of misallocations, because again, if you maybe buy in bulk because it's a high volume product, you wouldn't get as much of the overhead as some company or product that is requiring small purchases but many. So you can see where that would help the misallocation problem. Phone expenses, you could keep track of maybe the number of minutes or the number of phones. So those would be some ideas there. Office supplies, that one's tough. Probably number of employees would be a suggestion, or you could come up with some other driver. Again, you can maybe look at it. Is it a lot of printing costs? For instance, if we go back to the example of the business school, if you have a lot of students, you may use more supplies if copying is a big piece of it. So again, you really look at that cost and see what's causing it, what's driving that cost, and then allocate accordingly. Office rent, typically it's the amount of space. So square footage would be a good one on that one. And likewise for janitorial services, square footage would be a good one. But again, it's going to be situational. You would look at it and see what makes most sense. A president's salary is really tough. A lot of businesses will use sales dollars, and with the assumption that the company's president would devote more of its times to the area of the company that generates more profit, so or greater sales. So let's look at 7-4. The question here is what allocation base to use, given that the majority of that 3 million is personnel costs. And personnel costs in the college would be driven by the number of faculty. The more faculty you have, the more health insurance and retirement costs you would have. So that, sorry about that. So that number of faculty makes sense. Number of students, that, just because the accounting department teaches more students or has more classes doesn't make its personnel costs be any higher. So number of faculty makes more sense.